This channel usually focuses on history or curios of Aberdeen and its surroundings, but today we're not just looking at the strongest beer in Aberdeen. No, not just the strongest beer in Scotland, or even the strongest beer in Europe. We're looking at the strongest beer
in the world!
Hasn't the beer scene been exciting over the last couple of decades? When I started hitting the pubs at the age of 18, a choice in beer meant that you could choose between several largely similar mass-produced lagers. Carling, Foster's, Tennent's, Carlsberg, Stella, none of them particularly enjoyable. There were some mass-produced ales too, Belhaven Best, John Smith's, Tartan Special, the Kewen's Export. Again, none of them very good. This state of play dates back to the 60s with the invention of the beer keg. Before then, pubs largely drew from local breweries, all making their own individual brews, supplying them in hand-drawn casks which have a shelf life of about 6 weeks, until it's tapped, at which point you have about 3 to 4 days to run through its contents before exposure to air spoils them. The keg changed all that. CO2 displaces the beer, leaving no air contact inside the vessel. Beer now has a shelf life of 4 months, regardless of when it's tapped, or arguably longer. What followed was a shift from independent brewers to national conglomerates who were ramping up to industrial scales of beer production, producing profit-driven recipes, minimising costs, and undercutting local producers, running them out of business. In the UK, this sparked the campaign for real ale in the 70s, as beer enthusiasts noticed their favourite tipples were disappearing. You may still to this day hear a member of the campaign lament the day they saw the Watney's Red Barrel Tap installed in their local. In America, however, some brewers were fighting the change by differentiating their beers as low-yield artisanal products. Early pioneers such as Anchor and Sierra Nevada developed their beers with bold new flavours, and the term microbrew was born.
Ooh, microbrewed.
This is what would evolve into the craft beer industry. In the early 2000s, craft beer was catching on in Britain, and no one was more enthusiastic about it than two Chiels fae the Northeast called James Watt and Martin Dickey, who founded a brewery called Brewdog in 2007. Today they have a mixed reputation, criticised as being too big to be craft and suffering several publicity setbacks in recent years. But in the early days they made innovative beers and were masters of the publicity stunt. They drove a tank through London, mocked drinks giant Diageo, had a stage feud with Aldi over copycat beers, they conditioned a beer under the sea, the list goes on. The marketing was always edgy and rubbed a lot of folks the wrong way.
Mega corporations, and the best way to protect yourself from them is with a shotgun.
But it was always effective.
You shoot them or yourself?
Them.
In 2008, they introduced a 12% ABV Imperial Stout called Tokyo. Beers of this strength are very common now, so it's amusing to look back on the ire this drew from the Portman Group at the time. Brewdog would respond in the next year by brewing the beer again at 18.2% ABV. At that time, it was the strongest beer to have been brewed in the UK. In November 2009, Brewdog brewed the world's strongest beer at 32%, breaking the record and taking the title from German brewer Schwarzbrau. That beer was Tactical Nuclear Penguin, an extreme imperial stout. Fractional freezing is used to get the beer this strength. This is a very old process discovered when cider was left out to store in the winter months. The water froze, and this could be separated from the rest of the liquid, which would now have a higher alcohol content, creating Applejack. Brewdog's process for creating this beer apparently involved using equipment at a local ice cream factory, although the recipe catalogue suggests you can do this at home with a normal freezer. Schwarzbrau would answer Brewdog with a new beer at 40%, which Brewdog answered in 2010 with Sink the Bismarck at 41%, this time based on an IPA. Apparently, temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius were required to produce this beer. The Germans fired back with yet another new version of Schwarzbock at 43%, but Brewdog would release The End of History, a blonde Belgian ale infused with nettles and juniper berries at 55%, beating the Germans once again in only their third year of brewing. It was an extremely limited release beer of 12 bottles, each packaged in a bespoke taxidermied stoat or grey squirrel. And so, for a while, the world's strongest beer was made on our doorstep in Aberdeenshire. Brewdog were still operating out of their rented Fraserburgh premises at the time, but I'm not sure if the freeze distillation would have been carried out there or the undisclosed ice cream factory. The beer requires temperatures of minus 70 degrees Celsius, so they rented some medical cryogenic equipment to make it happen. Apparently, it's possible to do this yourself by using dry ice and isopropyl alcohol, but I really wouldn't recommend that. Brewdog's Columbus Brewery would celebrate a repeal in Ohio state law, which prevented the production of beers over 12% in 2016 by reissuing this beer on a limited production run. But this time, it was only available for those who had invested over $20,000 or more in their American operations. Schwarzbrau would follow up with a beer called Schwarzbock Fini Coronat Opus at 57%. But the world's strongest beer today is a collaboration between the two breweries called Strength in Numbers, weighing in at 57.8% ABV. The Guinness Book of Records still shows The End of History as the strongest beer ever sold. It should probably listed as the most expensive beer ever sold as well, given the price of £500 a bottle. But before I conclude this video, I have to include a footnote. Unfortunately, due to a raft of lazy journalism, if you Google the strongest beer in the world, you'll find the results salted with mentions of a different drink. Brewmeister Snake Venom is not beer. It is a cocktail of beer mixed with straight ethanol to reach its label strength of 67.5% ABV. In fact, it's not even beer mixed with ethanol, it's ethanol mixed with beer. This ingredients list shows there's more ethanol than beer in this bottle. It's not even brewed by Brewmeister.
I can think of at least two things wrong with that title.
So, what's going on here? Brewmeister, a now defunct brand, was founded in 2012 and produced beers such as Neon Blonde, a pale ale, Supersonic IPA, a take on the American West Coast style, and 10, a nuclear-charged rock beer, which clocked in at 10%. Or so the label said anyway. In 2013, they released a beer called Armageddon, which they claimed was the world's strongest beer at 65% ABV. Unfortunately for them, some skeptical beer geeks decided to independently lab test the drink. One lab found the drink to be 16% ABV. That's 16, not 60. Another lab found it to be only about 10%. And when Brewmeister themselves sent their beer away to be tested, the results came back at 15%. Now, it's not surprising that a brewery in its second year of operation, while they were still trying to figure out how to stop putting out the occasional gusher bottle, wasn't able to break a world record on their first attempt. And nobody would have thought less of them. But they persisted with the concept and released Snake Venom at a reported 65.7% ABV, and reported on their site, quote, "If it falls short, we can correct this with pure alcohol. If we correct the ABV, we have to add alcohol as an ingredient." And no figures as to how much alcohol was added were ever released, but if the base beer was still only 15% and they were using grain-neutral spirit, that's only 15 millilitres of beer per 330 milliliter bottle. If they're using the same stuff a lot of gin distilleries use as a base spirit, which clocks in at 96%, that's still only 116 millilitres of beer. Now, maybe they cracked the process and are brewing the base beer at a higher strength now, but at £40 a bottle, I'm not paying to find out. In 2014, Brewmeister reorganised as Keith Brewery, and I'm not going to knock them because these guys seem to have figured out what they're doing. They are now making some solid beers, so I raise my glass to you. Well done on turning things around, guys. This is tasty. But I really question why you relaunched Snake Venom in 2017. This does not need to exist. You can't really visit the site of the old Brewdog Brewery in Fraserburgh, where the beers mentioned in this video were most likely brewed, but you can see it from the road. Not long after the end of history, Brewdog moved to a state-of-the-art brewery in Ellon. If you'd like to explore more, they have a tap room, bottle shop, good food, and do tours. They also have 3 bars in Aberdeen if you don't fancy the drive to Ellon. Chances are slim they'll have any of the beers I've mentioned in stock, but occasionally there are reissues, so it's not impossible. If Brewdog's not your thing and you want to support local brewers, also consider visiting Fierce or 6 Degrees North, who both have bars in the city centre, or take a trip to Peterhead and visit the Brew Toon Brewery and Bar. If this video has inspired you to give brewing a go yourself, Aberdeen's Homebrew shop on Hutchins Street is definitely worth a visit. Oh, I don't know about you guys, but I'm thirsty now, so I'm going to end the video here. Cheers.
So fortified wines are usually protected, you just can't call anything port or sherry, for example. But apparently, if you can just add beer to any strong spirit, call it fortified beer, then claim it's the world's strongest beer, then you guys are about to witness a new world record. So I'm just going to take some beer and add it to this absinthe. I have just created the world's new strongest beer. This is daft.